So in this topic, we are going to discuss questions like how the class is created, what is class expression, and we are going to discuss static members. There will be 6 relative questions to these topics. I assume that you have already gone through previous questions of object literal and this object before you move on this section. Classes are very commonly used in various languages. In JavaScript also, you can create classes. The whole concept of class is to create a blueprint or design, or commonly referred as a prototype. Then of this prototype, you can create as many instances as you want. For example, on paper you design a house which has number of rooms, windows, doors, and color properties. Now when the actual house is created from this design, there can be different values for each of the actual house. Like this object has 5 rooms and different values, gray color, and this house has 7 rooms, different windows, doors, and let's say color is maybe blue. Here each house is called as an object or instance of class house. This is the instance, or you can say that you have created this house from this blueprint. The advantage of this pattern is reusability, but it's not something you can understand unless you implement it practically in a project, which you will realize at a later stage of this tutorial. But in this section, we will still go through many concepts of classes and basics. In ES6, we have a class keyword to create a class, whereas in ES5, we were using a constructor function. We will at least once go through the ES5 syntax, but let's concentrate on ES6 at the moment. So let me create a class called house itself. Now there is something called constructor. This constructor is basically a kind of method which is executed automatically when you create the instance of this class. Let's say I just want to put console log and constructor called. Now how will I create the object of this class? I will say const or maybe let obj is equal to new house. That means I'm creating a new instance of class house. I can create as many instances as I want, so I'm going to create few more instances here. So I have 2 instances now, obj and obj1. That's fine. Now because I'm creating 2 instances, every time this new house is called, it's going to call the constructor. Constructor is a method which is executed immediately you create the instance of a class. Let me run this code. So you see that the constructor is called 2 times. For example, I want that there has to be property as well, or maybe more properties. Then what I can do, I can say this dot, let's say number of doors is equal to, now I can say 5 here maybe, and I'll say this dot, let's say windows is equal to, for example, 10. Now instead of giving fixed value, what I can do, I can pass parameters, I can pass arguments to the constructor. So what I will do, I will say a comma b, for example, and then I say a here and maybe b here. Instead of this, generally the practice is we use the same name, let's say number of doors and windows. So when you say this dot and doors and this dot windows, that means this is a property of class house, right? And this is just a value which is received by the constructor, which I am applying in a moment. But I'm going to say and doors here and windows here. So remember this and doors. This right hand side is this variable, and this left hand side, that is member of class house. So now I am going to pass, let's say in the first house there are 5 doors and 10 windows, and in the second house we have 7 doors and 12 windows. That's it. Let's also create a method here. Now we already know what is a property and method because we have already seen all these things in object literal section. I'm going to create a method called show data. I'll say console log n doors, number of doors, comma this dot number of windows. That's it. So now the prototype looks something like this. Now let me just say obj.showData and obj1.showData. Let me run this code now. So here we have two different values, 5 and 10, 7 and 12. So as you can see that both obj and obj1, they have different data set here. So that's how a basic class is created, and this is what a constructor is in the ES6 syntax. The way we discussed about dynamic properties and dynamic method names, that we can do with classes also. We have already discussed that in object literal, that how can we have dynamic properties. Let's say here you want to have dynamic method name. So what you can do, for example, I can say let get data is equal to, the value I want to have is show data only. So now instead of show data, I'm going to write a variable here. I'll say get data. So this is get data, which is a variable, and that has a value called show data. Now here I'm calling show data only, right? So if there is get data, it should display an error. Let's see what happens. It is still executing. The reason is this get data is dynamic. That is because we have covered it into square brackets. It is going to consider that there is a variable which contains some value, and that name is actually the valid name. Let's remove this A here and run it again. You see, now it has stopped working. So it is correctly working because we have the dynamic method. Similarly, you can have dynamic members. This dot, you can put a square bracket and you can deal with it. Easy to understand that. Here you see that these are the members of the class. And doors is numeric value, of course. Windows is also numeric, but these are the properties, whereas this is the method of a class. Let me remove this dynamic thing now. I'll just say show data, and I don't need this get data here. So here we have different types of members. That is, we have a method and also these numeric values. We may have any type of value, doesn't matter. What I want to highlight here is that the member, that is, let's say I wanted to call maybe show data or any other method or any other member for that matter, I have to instantiate the class. If I do not create an instance, I cannot access members of the class. There are situations where you want to have members, but you do not want to instantiate the class. The situations which you may not get right now if you have exposure with Angular or maybe React, you get the idea that we create services. Services which are called directly and we do not want to instantiate. In such case, you can create static members. If you cannot correlate with a practical situation, doesn't matter at the moment, but at least you should know how to create a static member. So let's try to create a static member here in this particular example. I will say static. Let's say the method name is test. That's it. Now I will display any message inside. Let's say static method called. That's it. I do not need to instantiate these at the moment. Certainly I can remove the constructor as well if I want to, and the show data method also. So imagine that this is just the static method we have here. We are not going to instantiate this. See this, how am I calling? I'm using the class name and I'll say test. That's it. So class name dot method name or member name in short, that's how you access the static member. Now if I run this, you see that the output is there. So we don't need to have an instance of a class to refer a static member. Let me also create a static property. I'll say static, maybe let's say application version. These are the things we put as static, maybe 1.2. So now if I want to refer it, I'll simply say console log house dot the app version. That's it. We don't need to instantiate class here. If you have a static method, let's say test1, one more static method inside the class, new method for example. In case if you want to call this test1 from this static method itself, then you can certainly write like this dot test1. You can do that. See, generally this refers to an instance. But here, even though the instance is not there, certainly you can write house.test1. But even if you write this.test1, it's going to work. So if I run this, you'll see that the static method called is displayed, new method, and of course the version. So this test1 is called with the this object also. So before we move to relative question, in the beginning I mentioned about constructor function syntax. As I said that the class keyword was introduced in ES6, but before that, that is in ES5, the function was acting as a class. So let me show you that also. This is the ES6 syntax. You have function house, right? Here we don't need a constructor. If you write a line here, let's say console log, then this is going to be the constructor itself. Let's say called. Now if I just call, like normally you see that we call the function like this, right? But instead of writing the name of the function, if you call it with new keyword, let's say I would prefer ES5 syntax only. So I'll say var obj is equal to new house. If I do this, this means it's just the way you call the function, it changes the behavior. Now it is acting as a constructor function, and this itself is a class. So I can say this dot, let's say Windows at the moment, right, is equal to, maybe you have parameters to the constructor, so you can write Windows here, right? And here you are passing the values. I can say var obj1 is equal to new house and different number of windows. So the code which we saw with class, in this case we have it with the constructor function syntax. This is ES5 syntax, so just get the idea about it. That's why I've mentioned it here, though it's not needed now to know how it works, but still you have this way of writing function. So if you say new and function name, that is going to act as a class. Let's discuss relative questions of this topic. The first question is, how can you create a class? So this is how you create a class. The second question is, when is the constructor called? So the constructor is called as soon as an instance of a class is created. So whatever you want to initialize, whatever process you want to have as initialization, that you can put in the constructor method. The third question is, can we have dynamic property or method names in a class? Yes, of course we can have it. This is how you can have it. Just put a square bracket and that method name or a property name can be dynamic. Fourth question, what is a class expression? We have already seen function expression. So there is a function, for example, like this. Then if you want to convert it into function expression, then how do you do that? You put the name before the function keyword, right? And you write it like this. Of course, if you write an arrow function, that is a function expression only. Now here when I say const test is equal to function, this is a function expression. Similarly, ES6 gives you class expression as well. When you say class expression, it means you write a class like this. You say class house, you write like this. This is what we have seen. Instead of this, you can say let house is equal to class, maybe test. You can remove this name also, doesn't matter, or you give a name, it is one and the same thing. So here instead of let, I would prefer to have const. Now let's say constructor, and I'll say console log only and called a message. Let's create an instance of this now. I'll say const obj is equal to new house. Let's run this. So this is a class expression. Normally you do not write this way, but yes, you do have class expression like a function expression in ES6. Fifth question is, what are static members in a class? What is the purpose of defining them as static? So we have already seen that we write just a static keyword and we can create static members. And the purpose, as I mentioned, that when you are creating a module which has services where you do not need to instantiate the class, you do not need an object like application version or maybe few other services related to versioning or application name, then generally we do not want to instantiate those classes. So we create a class and we create those members as static members. The sixth question is, how can you call another static method from a class? So this we have already seen that you can say class name dot method name, or even this dot, like in this case, this dot test1 did call the test1 method.